Hi, I'm Rebecca DeHarling, and with me today is fellow Paper Lantern writer Kathryn Pritchett. We're talking about Jonathan Lee's The Great Mistake. And Kathryn's going to tell us, well, she suggested the book to me, and I'm so glad she did because we'll be talking today about how much we loved it and why. So, Kathryn, do you want to explain how you first came across the book?
Sure. So I saw a glowing review of it, probably in the New York Times, and I knew that it was about the time period that I was immersed in because I'm writing a novel set during this era about Maude Adams, an actress of that same Gilded Age period. And I decided I'd read it just to get some period details, but I sort of dismissed it before it came, thinking, oh, this is going to be a boy book, right? It's
Yeah.
it's about a man, it's about building. Um, I expected it to be somewhat dry but useful research, and boy was I surprised at how much I loved it and found it to be anything but just a boy book. So that's
Yes.
how it came to me.
Yes.
And I've now read it a couple of times. I was listening to it again today to prepare for this, and it still holds up. It's just a beautiful book. But it's a book that I think does take a little warming to because it's so complex, the writing. I mean, it's not difficult to read, but it's when you want to take your time reading as you go through because it's not long, but it's deep. So you can be a little curious all the way through. For example, about the title itself. I mean, it wasn't until I got to the end of the book I thought, now wait a minute, what is the great mistake here? Did you have that feeling when you first read it?
Yes. Well, I mean, I think I thought, spoiler alert, I
Mm-hmm.
thought it was a case of mistaken identity. I think by that time I had thought that, but you know, I think you mentioned, and when we were talking about it before, Kathryn, there are other mistakes too, and of course, there's uh, we should say the book is about Andrew Haswell Green, who's called the father of Greater New York, and he did so many
Mm-hmm.
things. He got Central Park going, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the New York Public Library, and the Museum of Natural History. Just so many things. And in
Mm-hmm.
fact, he was what they call him the father of Greater New York because he pushed to have the boroughs united as Greater New York. And that was also called the Great Mistake of
Right.
1898 at the time by
That's
an
number
opponent.
that's number two, right? That's the publicly known great mistake,
Yes,
right?
yes, yes.
Uh-huh. And then I would say there's a third, and that's just the nature of Andrew Haskell Green, that some people, including his father, might have thought his orientation, et cetera, made him the great mistake.
Mhm.
That he wasn't what all that his father hoped he would be, and to himself, he wasn't entirely sure that the acceptance of who he was and how he moved through the world. So, but as you said, there are mistakes all the way through. I think that's some of the brilliance of the way Jonathan Lee, the author, has structured this book, is that every page is filled with little mistakes
Yes.
that all add up to a great mistake. Were there some that were particularly memorable to you that stayed with you, the little mistakes?
Yes. One where it's toward the end of his life, and he goes to see his brother, Oliver, and
Mm-hmm.
he had misunderstood something that Oliver had said to him like 13 years before. Um,
Mm-hmm.
in the book, Andrew has feelings for a young man named Samuel when he's a teenager, maybe 15, and sort of tries to snuggle up against him and is rebuffed by Samuel and the parents. So and then later he has a special friend, Samuel Tilden, who was I mean, he became the governor of New York, ran for president. So there were two Samuels in his life. And Oliver had said to Andrew, are you still grieving your special friend Samuel? And Andrew thinks he means the Samuel that he knew as an adult and thinks, well, why would you say that? It's only been a year. But he doesn't say anything. And he goes to see his brother after 13 years and he brings this up. And Oliver says, I didn't mean Samuel Tilden. I meant the Samuel from when you were a teenager. And even though he says that, and Andrew regrets that he's lost all these years, he still leaves. And it says, well, and he still doesn't have very much contact with Oliver in the future. And I found that one really sad.
Yeah, it's very poignant, isn't it?
It really
He's
is.
such a closed man that
Yes,
it's impossible to have an open conversation, even with his brother who cares for him. Yeah,
yes, yes.
I
And yet
thought
he
so
he
too.
yeah, he
Go ahead.
longs for love. I mean, that because of his sexual orientation and the time that he lived in, there's one part where um, Jonathan Lee says he and Samuel Tilden, the adult, they're special friends for many years, but at least the way Lee portrays it they never consumed that feeling, because when one of them was feeling braver, the other one was in a state of fear, and it kept seesawing like that. And they were never at the same place at the same time. And that was, it seems like that's something that happens often in life, where people just aren't at the same place at the same time. And I thought that was such a great insight.
Yeah, I thought so too. And you could definitely feel the affection between them,
Yes,
but
yes.
realize that the time and place and who they were uh, and their positions in life would not
Yes,
allow that to happen.
they were so well known. Yes. There were a couple quotes about love. Um,
Hmm.
this is about Andrew. He would go looking for it everywhere in the years to come. Love, 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 as if it were a coin to be found in a field or a park, as if it could be obtained without forfeiture. I just,
Mm.
example of his amazing writing. It's
I
so
know.
you'll be going along, and then all of a sudden he'll throw this in, and you'll be like, "Oh my gosh!"
No, it just captures it so perfectly, doesn't it? With fairly few words. It's not that he's
Yeah.
long-winded or has to hammer it home by saying it over and over again. Yeah, beautiful.
Yes.
Well, I love the little things like on the day you find out in the beginning of the book, within the first few pages, that Andrew Green is murdered on his doorstep at age 83. And there are little things like he wasn't carrying any. It was happened on Friday the 13th. That he wasn't carrying any fetishes for protection that day, no rabbit's foot, that sort of thing. I mean, almost toss away lines about the mistakes that were being made that day.
Yes.
Um, he feared, for example, they wouldn't name a bridge or building after him because he was curmudgeonly. Had he been a nicer man, maybe we all would have heard of him. I certainly
Yes.
hadn't heard of
I
him before I
know.
read this book. He hesitates at the entrance to his own home on that day. These are all right from the beginning pages. He says, because of this hesitation and 1,000 other factors, a raw sprawl of coincidences and missteps and mistakes, a measure of bad luck and a degree of design, he would soon be lying on the ground with his face to the sky, sprawled and embarrassed, twitching, well on his way to becoming, in the words of one cab driver across the street, dead as a tent peg. So, such a delightful, rare, long sentence in this book of all the mistakes that lead to even our final moments, right?
Yes.
Had he not stopped to pick up some chestnuts that somebody had thrown on the street, had he not done this, had he carried the rabbit's foot, he would have
Yes.
lived another day.
Mhm.
Anyway, every page as I reread the book was filled with little mistakes like that tweak somebody's life, not only
Yes.
his, but everyone's in the book. Um, how would you describe him to somebody else, Andrew Haswell Green? To someone who hasn't read the book, my brother saw that we were doing this and texted me today, and he said, I looked up that book you're talking about. Looks pretty interesting. Tell me about it. So, how would you describe Andrew Haswell Green?
Well, he was such a complex man, and in part, I think, because he had to keep so much of who he was hidden, his sexual orientation, because of the times, but also the way he was raised was designed to not give him confidence, and yet he was very strong-willed. I mean, not to say that he wasn't affected by the fact that his father could seem to only ever criticize him, but
Mm-hmm.
um, he determined that he was going to make something of himself, and he went about it in a methodical fashion, um,
Mm-hmm.
using whatever came to hand as, a method. And it's sort of, it seems like the public works that he did, and Leach says this in a way to assuage his loneliness, that he would try to do things for the greater community, and also to atone a little bit for some things he had done when he goes to a Trinidad as a young man and sort of regrets some things he did there, and that people were displaced when they built Central Park. So, a man who was determined to make something of himself, then also used that power to do wonderful things for New York.
And didn't particularly seek the limelight, right? I mean,
No,
I think
no.
that's why we don't really know about him. Unlike Samuel Tilden or other people, it seemed that as though he was ambitious, he wanted resources and I think to create a private space. We would probably say it was OCD today.
Mhm.
He wanted control over his life and his things,
Yeah.
but he didn't particularly want to be in the limelight at all.
Yes, yes.
So,
Yeah, the OCD thing really comes out when he was a child. He would clean his siblings' boots at night, even though his brothers would bully him and make fun of him for doing that. And then even on his last day, as you said, he stops to pick up chestnut shells because he doesn't want to
yes,
see litter in New York City. Yes, yeah,
exactly. Yeah. Yeah, the picking up the trash I thought was a marvelous little
yeah.
detail. I don't know if that's true about him or if Lee invented that for the character,
Mhm,
but I thought that was a great detail.
mhm.
So I hadn't heard of him before. You hadn't heard of him before.
No, no.
Beyond the fact that he wasn't seeking the limelight, any other theories as to why he's not really in the public eye the way other people of the period? There's lots of oversized characters. Cameos show up in the book, like a Boss Tweed or Frederick Law Olmsted, people we've heard of. Why haven't we heard of Green?
Yeah. Or even Theodore Roosevelt, right? Who says Theodore
Right.
Roosevelt was a little afraid of Green because he had sort of could have like a little bit of a biting wit sometimes. Yes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, of course, one goes to his sexual orientation. And we don't know exactly what people speculated about that, but he was never married. And they do mention that, they told his friend Samuel Tilden that, and said afterward, perhaps if you had had a wife, you would have won the presidency. So, it's hard to say why some people stay in the limelight and some fade, but yeah, it's a little bit hard to explain because he did so much. It's almost unbelievable how much he did.
Right, I know. He was so instrumental in the New York that we know today,
Mhm,
the major sites that we all go to see. I do think that not being married, not having posterity, perhaps not having champions of
mhm,
his legacy are part of the
mhm.
reason. I don't know how much you read about the backstory of the book, but Jonathan Lee talks about becoming interested in this because he was wandering through Central Park and sees this out of the way bench
Mhm.
that's the only monument or marker that's a tribute to Andrew Haswell Green. And he himself had just come to America from England and thought, well, everyone must know this man, that
Yes,
he's got a bench in Central Park. And of course, no one knows who he is.
yes.
So,
Yeah, I thought that was a great story. Like, and also for, as a writer, it's like, what a wonderful story of inspiration. This thing that you come on completely unexpectedly. He had no idea he was going to be writing a novel like this, but that
right,
moment brought about this
right.
book. I love that story too. Yeah.
I thought it was really good too. What secondary characters caught your attention? I mean, it's not just about Green. There's a whole cast of characters here. Like I said, the cameos of the famous people, but the everyday people in his life. Who caught your attention and what was interesting
Oh,
about them
oh,
to you?
so, there were so many when I started thinking about that question. Of course, and I don't know if you even call him a secondary character. We haven't mentioned that the Detective
Mm-hmm.
McCluskey, who is charged with, the crime, and there's no doubt about who does it. The man is still standing there after he's shot Green. He
Right.
doesn't deny that he did it, and he couldn't because there were many witnesses. But McCluskey has to come up with a motive because he, understands that a jury will need to know the reason. And he appears a lot in the book, so maybe as much as second only to Andrew. But there are so many little wonderful details about him.
Mhm.
The first thing you learn about him was that the other police make fun of him because of an elephant. There was an elephant at Coney Island that was, causing ruckus, and the police had the trainer of the elephant, and they came to the police station, and the trainer insisted on the elephant going inside the police station. The elephant gets stuck, and McCluskey's sort of an advocate for the elephant. I mean, this has nothing to do, of course, with what happened to Andrew Haswell Green, but it's just it made me like him from the get go. And then, but then
Mhm.
they'll have other little things, like there was one part about, oh, I loved this one. He has he's sick. He's feeling like, oh, I have a head cold. He says, and his wife says it's just the flu that perhaps men feel more than women do. And then there's the amount of women complaining that men complain because they're sick. And said, but she was wrong. She was often wrong about things. He, however, was only ever misled. And it's just, and at the end, he's talking about how being a policeman, detective, you think that you have a lot of confidence at the beginning, but then as you learn more and more about life and what's out there, you just sort of shrink. And I thought that was a really fascinating insight, because usually when you have that kind of character, they're becoming more and more confident because they've had more and more
Mhm.
success. But I loved
Mhm. Yeah. No. When I think back on him, I think about him sniffling. I just have this sense of him constantly congested, and yet here he is, the man who's supposed to be getting to the bottom of this, but he's already in a fog, right?
yes,
Because
yes.
at least the way the book is set up, it takes the entire book really to understand
Mhm.
why the man who shoots him. Right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I loved him too. I thought Bessie Davis was fascinating. I didn't realize that I had not heard of her before. She's a madame in New York City, a black woman who was one of the wealthiest women at the time and is
Mhm,
integral to this story. Um, I thought Samuel Tilden was interesting. I'd not heard of him either.
mhm.
The father, of course, though he's a terrible figure in the book, I thought he was
Yes,
drawn very well. Yeah.
yes.
Again, just a huge cast of characters in a very small book. The book is only 300 pages long. It's
Yeah,
not
yeah,
very
there's so
big.
much in there. Yes, I have to say Mrs. Bray too, who is the
Oh,
housekeeper.
yes.
The way she's introduced in the story is Andrew pays her to sort of play a trick on Samuel Tilden so that Andrew can sort of get into his good graces, and then she just is his housekeeper forever. And you just think she's this very practical woman. She's still his housekeeper on the day he dies, and she came to them like
Mhm.
30 or 40 years before that. And then there's just one
Mhm.
little thing, and this is so typical of what Lee does, that you just think, oh, because she's writing a letter to this woman whom her husband had years ago refused to let her visit. And you think, oh,
Mhm.
there was something there with this other woman, but that's all he says. And it
Mhm.
gives her instantly, another dimension and depth, and
Mhm.
it's great.
Without having to drop into a lot of backstory to tell you
Yes,
about.
yes, yes.
Yeah, I love the description of her. The first time you meet her, her hair is curled like copper, I think.
Mhm,
It's
mhm,
got this metallic
mhm,
um, fierceness and resilience to it,
mhm,
right?
mhm.
She's
Yeah.
she's also a good comic foil. We were going to talk about the humor in the book, though this seems like, again, my misgivings that the book would be a dry historical boy book. This is also a very funny book.
It's very
And
funny.
one, one of the first introductions to her, he's coming home because he has to be there on time. She is his timekeeper, and if he's not there for lunch, she will give him no end of grief. And he realizes that she's going to probably feed him fish again, and he hates the particular kind of fish she cooks. So he
Yes,
says she tortured him with this, her insistence on fish.
yes, yes. Yeah, there are so many places that I'm gonna read a couple examples because it's just,
Please.
um so this is toward the end of the book. He's talking to his nephew Timothy, and his nephew says, "Well, even at this stage of life, you could still get a wife. Wouldn't you like someone, with you as you basically finish out your life. And of course,
Mhm.
he's not interested in having a wife. And so he says,
Confirmed bachelor.
salt. So he doesn't answer. He just says, pass the salt. And then they start talking about the subway. And he says, I'm gonna live to see the subway. And then it says he's gotten the salt. Before proceeding to add salt to his food for a second time with even greater vigor than before, perhaps because he was growing forgetful in his old age, or because his taste buds had begun to dim with each passing day, or because it was his set intention to preserve part of his portion of potatoes for the ages. So unexpected. And then there'll be times that are just like heart-wrenching, sort of. And this example is toward the end when Tilden, his friend, dies, and he's thinking about everything that he, Andrew, has done for the city. And it says, and yet it occurred to him here briefly, pointlessly, belatedly, with the airy abstraction of a weather forecast, that all this public work might not mean as much as having a friend holding your hand as you die. Love. This was the way not to fall into forgetting love and a good publicist. He just adds that little thing on it, but it doesn't take away from the
No,
poignancy of what he has just said. In a way, it almost highlights it by the contrast. I just
it does. It's just a little bada bing at the end. Yeah, another thing I read with Lee, he said, I'm not funny in real life. He said, I'm not known for my humor, but he said, I like to leave space in my work for that to show up. And I do think it's just slid in places. It doesn't feel heavy-handed, but it's there all the way through. They're running lines. Yeah. These are two more, again, from the beginning of the book. So on pages 9 and 10, the newspaper, he's describing how the newspapers all report the weather of the day differently, for example, as they report the murder of Green. Then they say, in the coverage of the murder of the century being only 3 years old.
Yes.
The hyperbole that
yes.
a newspaper writer would use. And then the next page, his family feared, this is talking about Green as a child who was bookish, unlike the rest of the family. His family feared he might one day succumb to the catastrophe of being a poet.
Yes.
So I assume that is Lee talking about himself as well.
Yes.
The catastrophe of being a writer.
It could be.
Yeah. So what about Lee's writing style appeal to you? Any takeaways for your own writing?
Well, I think the humor thing is what appealed to me the most. I am not funny in person or in my writing, so I can't do that. But what I did think about a lot as I was reading it the second time, especially, was he doesn't always follow what you think of as the rules. There were so many times when he has a scene and then he'll go off somewhere and then he'll come back. And if you had beta readers looking at that, they'd be like, you got to take that out. So the scene where he's going to get baptized, because he has to get baptized in order to get this position to go to Trinidad. And it's going to be by immersion. And it's cold. It's the winter. And they're going to put him in the river. So the preacher is kind of like saying, well, I hope you don't get a cold, and said, I haven't lost anybody yet that I know of. So that's or that. And then in the middle of it, they talk about the sinking of the it's a steamboat, the Erie, I think, and talks about, for a long paragraph or two about the fact that the sun, in the middle of this scene where he's supposed to be getting baptized, and then at the end he puts one of those little zingers in and said, at first they thought there were this many casualties, but then as the time went on, there were more casualties. Oh, I wonder if I can quickly find the anyway, he says something like, despite, one assumes, all the people in the middle of the country having prayed. So it's just like, and again, it's like a nod to now, right? How many times has something happened and people are like, oh, prayers, not that that's a bad thing, but it's certainly a thing. And
it becomes a cliche. Yeah.
Yes, it does. It does. So.
Yeah.
And so this
Yeah.
idea that if you do it well, and that's the tricky part, right? You don't, you can flout the rules. I mean, as they always say, you have to know why you're doing it and execute it well. But I really liked that.
Yeah.
He does that kind of thing
I do
again
too.
and again, and go off on some tangent.
It's a little like totally different genres, but David Sedaris, who can meander around and then
Yeah.
finally get to his point. And other people you would say, yeah, chop that or yawn, right? But instead you're fascinated by the detours, and
Mhm.
somehow they lead you back to the point that
Yes,
was being
yes,
made.
yes.
Yeah. Again, in an interview, I saw that he had that initially this book was twice as long. It was 600 pages, and he cut it down to less than 300. Now talk about revision, right?
Yes, wow.
Um, that would have been a very different book, I think. And I don't
Mhm.
know whether some of the reviewers made a point that we don't see him doing any of the things he's known for. We don't see him lobbying for Central Park, particularly. We don't see
Yeah.
the Met going up. We don't see the Natural History Museum going. We get a little scene of him on the Brooklyn Bridge, which he was also instrumental in. But I assume that the 600-page version of this had that in there,
Oh,
and yet
maybe.
I didn't miss seeing that. It
No.
was enough to know that those things were exist, but that wasn't what this book was about. It was a much
Mhm.
more personal book about this man, not what he did.
Yes.
And I thought that was a lesson to take from here. I think the New York Times says Lee's novel artfully wonders whether we might be remembered instead somehow for who we were and not what we did. And I
Mhm.
think that's more what this book is about. So
Yes,
something
yeah,
to think about.
yes.
I liked a quote Lee said when he talked about writing historical fiction, since we're both historical fiction writers. He says that it's informed imaginings. I
Mhm.
thought that was a nice way to look
Yeah,
at what we
yeah,
do, right?
yes,
You read all this research, you try and project yourself into another time period and place. So it's
yeah,
informed, but you're still imagining what's there.
yes, yeah, yeah, I saw that review too. I liked that too, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, do questions of legacy haunt you? Do you feel like, oh, I've got to leave my mark somehow?
No, I have to say. I think I have no illusions or that, I'm going to have. I mean, I just hope, think about the question I was thinking, I just hope my family remembers me as somebody who, you know, loved her family and tried to be a good person. And, maybe if the only thing is, mom wasn't afraid to try new things, like that's like my third thing in life I've tried at least. So maybe that, but, nobody's going to know that except my kids and possibly my grandkids. How about you?
You don't think there won't be a park for you in some prominent bench somewhere in some prominent park? Yeah. No, I feel the same way. I think I want to have my best foot forward in the future, as as much as you can. But I'm realistic that there are so many people and so many things to pay attention to, but there is, I think, as a writer, there's a sense that you want your work to be perceived well.
Mhm.
Do you have that feeling? Certainly do. But I want the books I've written, the short stories, the articles, etc., that whoever stumbles upon them in the future, that I was able to tell the stories I wanted to tell and tell them in a way that was made a connection. So I think there's a
Yes,
little bit of legacy
yes,
desire there.
that's true. And it's funny because I know one writer, and she's like, "Well, I don't, it's not about book sales for me." And I think, well, then nobody's going to read your book. If they aren't buying it, I don't know if they're going to read it. The libraries at least have to buy it too. And yes, I mean we want to be read. That's
Mhm.
certainly.
Yeah, that's part of it. So back to the mistakes. They say, this book is all about mistakes and how they made him who he was, all the various mistakes through his life to do for us. So, what mistakes have you made, and how they? You don't have to detail everyone. This is not a confessional here, but how have the mistakes made you who you are today in your life? We focus so much on triumphs, but how have the mistakes informed your life?
Kathryn, I really thought about this. I thought you're going to come across as a jerk if you say I can't think of any mistakes I made. But I think it's because things that were potentially mistakes, I try to look at what happened that was good from it.
Mhm.
So like, was it a mistake to stop writing my dissertation in Spanish language and literature? Maybe. But
Mhm.
then I have always focused on, well, then I would have, perhaps been in academia. Would I have liked that life? I don't know. Would I have ever gotten to, do other things I did in my life? No, I would have been caught up in academia. So maybe that was a
Mhm.
mistake, but uh, my father once told me something when I was trying to make like a big life decision. And I thought this, I thought about this a lot and shared it with my kids and even my grandkids who are too young to really get it. But he said, no matter what decision you make, you'll make it be the right one. And I really
Mhm.
liked that. And so, yes, I've made many mistakes, but I try to not have too many regrets.
That's great. I think that's the wisdom of the ages, right? You worry so much about your mistakes when you're a teenager and 20s and 30s. And I remember somebody telling me at one point, nobody is really looking at what you're doing.
Yeah,
They're all
that's
focused on their
comfy.
own mistakes, right? And that is very freeing to realize you're the only one who's paying attention to it. I think about all sorts of things as I ponder this question about everything from who I dated to what I've eaten to clothes I've worn that were definitely mistakes. I was a teenager in the 70s, so let's just say disco was my jam. But life is a constant process of revision, and I think you learn what you like, what you're willing to spend time on, who you're willing to spend time with through making mistakes. I'm currently reading a very fun memoir called The Paper Garden. I don't know if
Oh.
you'd ever seen this. Amazon suggested this to me, so
Oh,
go figure. But it's about an artist in the 1700s, a woman who became a collage artist, and she did beautiful botanical
oh.
collages. I don't know if you can see this. Anyway, the woman writing it becomes enamored, is a poet and becomes enamored, Molly Peacock, of her work. And so this morning, as we were about to prepare for this, I was reading a section and she talked about perfectionism. She says, great technique means you have to abandon perfectionism. This is the contemporary woman writing about this woman from the 1700s. Perfectionism either stops you cold or slows you down too much. And I
Mm.
think learning to make mistakes and realizing that you are going to make mistakes keeps you from being paralyzed by perfectionism. She
Mhm.
says, from there, you proceed into the practice that eventually becomes expertise. So I think rather than trying to be a perfect anything, wife, mother, friend, whatever, you learn to become more expert at it. And I think that applies to writing as well. I
Yeah.
certainly thought about this in terms of all the mistakes I've made in my writing career, just in the craft of writing, the things that, I ran a manuscript through one of those grammar programs, Pro Writing Aid. And I realized I said over and over again the phrase a bit, a little bit,
Yeah.
learning that this is one of my foibles and I have to watch out for that. That makes my writing better. So I
Yeah.
do think the mistakes and learning from them are what's the point
Yes.
there.
Yes. Many mistakes in that area. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think this is a wonderful book. I would strongly recommend it to anyone. It's less than 300 pages. It's about a fascinating man. If you're interested in historical fiction at all, it's a quick and beautiful read. One of my favorites of the last few years, and one worth rereading. It's that good. So that would be my recommendation about The Great Mistake. It's no mistake to read this book.
That's right. That's right. And I would add to that, don't start out reading tiny snippets. That's what I did the first time I read it, and that was a mistake. Get yourself well into it so you can kind of see what he's doing and you'll start to appreciate it much more that way. So
Yeah, we didn't talk about that, but the structure, he says calls himself a structure geek. I think the structure of the way the book's set up is that each chapter is one of the gates that goes into Central Park,
mhm.
and the name of the gate has
Yeah,
something to do with the theme of that
yes,
particular chapter.
yes, yeah,
Um, it took me a while to figure out that that's what was going
yeah,
on too.
yeah, that
So
was also just a masterful touch.
it was masterful all the
Okay.
way through, but which does not mean boring.
Right.
masterful in terms of engaging you. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Kathryn. Thanks to everybody who's joined us.
Yeah.
And yes, we heartily recommend this book. I think that our next Fifth Friday is going to come up pretty soon. It's at the end of September. So we hope we haven't decided yet what we're going to be talking about, but we hope to see you then and hope you enjoyed this. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks. Bye, everyone.